On the Jewish calendar, there are many holidays that are based on tragic events. Last night at sundown, one of them began. Yom Hashoah, known in English as Holocaust Remembrance Day, is a solemn occasion that doesn't carry with it any particular formal rituals. It is a day to reflect on the 6 million men, women, and children who were murdered simply for being Jewish. Now, 70 years after the Holocaust ended, we are left with the task of keeping their memory and their martyrdom alive, as those who survived the death camps pass away can no longer bear witness to the worst atrocity ever experienced in human history. Joining us now with insight into the importance of Yom Hashoah and the role tragedy plays in Jewish life is Rabbi Mark Wildes, founder and director of the Manhattan Jewish Experience. Rabbi, it's nice to have you here with us.
Thank you for having me.
Tell me how this particular remembrance came into play, came into being.
Well, immediately after the Second World War, there was a great interest on the part of the survivors, specifically, that their story be told and that there be a day of commemoration. It's interesting because the Jewish people, as you just mentioned, have many days and events, unfortunately, tragic, of persecutions. We have a day already where we commemorate all of those persecutions in the summer, called Tisha B'Av, the 9th of the Hebrew month of Av, when our temples were destroyed. But the survivors wanted a different day only to think about specifically the Holocaust.
And is that what is done on this day? It's an opportunity to simply be reflective about the Holocaust?
Yeah, there are really no specific rituals. Most in the Jewish community will come to a memorial program, to light a candle, maybe to hear about one of the heroic stories of a survivor. That's what the organization I run does each year. We interview a survivor, which I think is the best way to really remember the Shoah, is to hear it from somebody who was there. And as you mentioned, we're getting to a point now where there are less and less survivors alive. And I think it's incumbent on our generation to get as many young people, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, to hear their personal accounts.
One of my good friends, a former producer of mine, both of her parents were Holocaust survivors. And it's been an important part of their life to tell their stories. And I know that she has said that her own children know the story. But are we concerned that the next generation, the children of these children, so they would be the great-great-grandchildren, are we concerned that they won't quite understand what it is that their ancestors had to experience?
So I'm not concerned that it will be forgotten. But I think the details and the emotion that goes along with what happened will be lost, because if you don't have firsthand accounts and people who were actually there to tell their harrowing stories of survival, it just doesn't make the same kind of emotional impact on people. And I do fear that if we forget the details and we lose the emotional connection, that we won't learn the lessons of the Holocaust. We'll know it happened, but it won't have the impact that it needs to have. What creates a real story is when people give specifics in terms of what happened and when. And the more detailed accounts that we can have, not only from survivors, but historians, about what happened, what led to it, the less deniers can have any real claim. And I think the more we can learn, because Judaism is very big on learning from history. We believe very much in the concept of memory. In Hebrew, we call it zachor, to remember. We recite the Kiddush every Friday night to celebrate our Sabbath, to remember that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. It's all about remembering. And it's not about living in the past. It's about taking the lessons of the past and applying them in the present so that the future will look different. I do sometimes feel that the Jewish community sometimes has an over-fascination with the Holocaust.
How do you mean?
I service young Jewish professionals in Manhattan, and a lot of the young Jews that I teach and have the privilege of trying to inspire know so much more about our persecution and about the Holocaust than they do have an appreciation for Israel or for the positive aspects of our faith, which prevail and clearly outweigh the negative. But so many associate being Jewish with being persecuted. And of course, it's a major part of our history. We can't deny that. But it needs to be balanced with the positive aspects. And so, and I believe this came about also because the most popular day in synagogue is Yom Kippur. It's the Day of Atonement. It's very important. But just a couple of days after Yom Kippur is over, there's a holiday called Sukkot. And Sukkot is a holiday of Jewish joy and celebrating life. And it's not a day where we're quaking in our boots and wondering if God's going to forgive us for our sins. It's a day to celebrate our very existence and our relationship with the Almighty. And there are just so many more Jews in synagogue on Yom Kippur than there are a few days later when we dance with the Torahs. It's called Simchat Torah. It's the end of the holiday of Sukkot. And that kind of feeds into this. More Jews are aware and spend more time thinking and talking about the Holocaust than they do about Israel in America. So we should not, God forbid, forget. We should learn the lessons. I've done a lot of research of my own, and I do a lot of teaching about the Shoah and about the Holocaust, but it needs to be balanced with the other aspects of what Judaism believes in, which is joy and celebration. So, that's a little of my concern. And I want to make one other point, which I think is important, that very few people, I believe, are aware of. The 1930s and 1940s in Germany was a time and a place where the greatest cultural and scientific innovation was taking place. University of Berlin was the Harvard of Europe. There were great rabbis that went to study there because it was just the intellectual elite. Hitler's inner circle were all either medical doctors or had PhDs. And yet they committed the worst atrocities of the 20th century. This is a lesson the world needs to learn, that just because we become more innovative and technologically sophisticated doesn't mean that it's paralleled with our moral advancement. And I think we make that mistake that just because a society is morally advanced, it doesn't necessarily mean that behaviorally or ethically it's where it needs to be.
And as we're told often, if we don't learn from our past, we're condemned to repeat it, which is why these conversations are important. Rabbi, thank you so much for spending some time. I enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.